Hi, everybody. I'm Tyson Seburn, and I gave this talk at IATEFL2021 a few weeks ago. And I thought I would do an extra recording of it just for anybody who wasn't able to attend, but also because I wanted to take my time a little bit. My talk is about disruption, and this really is something that goes along with not only LGBTQIA2, but all types of underrepresented, oppressed, or marginalized people. And so I'd like to talk to you today about what that means to disrupt this heteronormative status quo in our ELT materials together. The way I view disruption as an approach or as a concept is really in terms of maybe a metaphor that might be easier to think about. So let's think of a river, like this guy here. And the river is actually a little bit polluted, but this man walking through the river sort of happily, carefree, doesn't seem to really notice the pollution at all. Later, he sort of wakes up a little bit and starts to realize, oh my gosh, there is some pollution in this river. I'm going to try my best to sort of pick it out on my own, one by one by one. That doesn't seem to work too effectively, or at least not entirely effectively. I mean, he's making a certain impact, but not certainly as much as he could if he involved more people. Now, of course, to involve more people, you have to get them to first care about it, and you actually have to get them to even acknowledge that there is a problem. So that is really the next step, isn't it? And so a third path on this disruption approach would be to get as many people involved as possible, right? To have them all go through the river and trying to pick up things together, kind of a community approach. Ultimately, the source of the pollution isn't going to go away by us picking things out as a community or individually. So we may need to actually go right to the source and make some sort of systemic change. And if we do that, then maybe the pollution itself will just go away. So like pollution in a river, there's a problem in our ELT materials in terms of inclusion. And so each one of these stages or steps is one way of improving the situation. And so today in this talk, I'm going to be talking primarily about step C. But first, I think we need to take a look at step B in order to see where we have come from so far. A long, long time ago, at an IATEFL far, far away, I gave a talk, which started kind of everything in terms of me being involved more globally. And so at that talk, I presented this course book, or at least a version of this course book before I had actually finished it. This course book unit, I should say. And shortly after that, I put the course book unit on my website. And what it was my attempt at showing teachers, materials writers, and publishers that there was a different way you could create a coursebook unit that did include LGBTQIA2 people. And in the meantime, I included some different types of people other than just gay people. But I did it through a usualization approach, which was one of the steps on that sort of disruption path that I showed at the beginning with the river. And the point of the usualization approach is largely that we make a wider variety of people appear usually alongside every other type of person and narrative in our ELT materials. And the focus of the materials isn't the sort of uniqueness or specialness of that particular group. It doesn't hide anything necessarily in terms of authentic characteristics, but the frequency at which we include a gay couple or a lesbian couple or transgender people or older people doing interesting things or disabled people, the frequency at which we include these underrepresented groups traditionally increases so much to the point where there is an opportunity to show individual characteristics. So there isn't just one person representing an entire group in that unit because they're the sort of token gay character. However, the focus of the unit isn't really on that characteristic or that character so much. And so this is why it's called a usualization approach. So anyway, let me give you a kind of insight as to what that might look like. One of the activities in the unit was this one. So the first thing that the students would need to do is listen to one person from each of these pairs describe their experiences with balance in their lives. And while they're listening, they would fill out the blue columns, right? So take notes on what that person says helps them in their life with their balance, and take notes about what challenges they face in their lives. And so I want to play a couple of audio clips just so you can hear what they sound like.
Sam's in senior year at uni, so there's a lot of pressure to study. Sometimes it's hard to get together with them. Having said that, they always try to call me every couple of days to talk, and we can talk for hours, which makes me happy.
Here's Levi and Tulip.
My family is very religious, and I'm not. This causes a lot of tension about many things, mostly marriage and kids. Actually, I don't want to get married. I'm happy enough with my little gorgeous puppy Tulip.
Okay, so in this one, you can see the same type of thing. What challenges does this person face? Their family seems to be a particular challenge with regards to pressuring them to get married, and what helps their dog, basically. So there's two examples of the audio. The second task would be then for the students to fill in the green parts, which is for them to make a connection with what is being talked about. And so a simple connection to make is to decide whether or not they also feel stress by these things that are challenges for each of these people. And finally, because this is a language course, of course, we're doing a listening task here, but there is a target language, which is contrast language. So the students then finally would listen for the word or phrase that each person used to show contrast, show these differences. And once they've done all of this and fit out all these charts, then they can compare it with the partner. So I don't know if you caught any of those, but you're not a student and this is not a test. Now, the next page has all of the sort of transcript for each of these characters. So this is what they have said and the students have listened to, so they can check their notes to see how right they were. But in this task, the students then finally need to see the names and connect those with actually what was said. So we'll do Sam and Suzanne because that's one of the ones we all listened to. So alongside all of these are pictures of the different people as well. And so Suzanne said they're in senior year at uni, so there's a lot of pressure. So you might remember that part. Then they said they always try to call me every couple of days to talk. We can talk for hours. It makes me feel a lot better. It makes me feel happy. So that's one task there. To do that is to match them up. And then, of course, they're checking that target language, which is the yellow part. And I don't know if anybody remembers or heard or paid attention, but it was having said that. So having said that is the phrase, in this case, the contrasting phrase that is the target language in this particular scenario. Now, the usualization part that happens here is, again, we're trying to increase the frequency by which underrepresented individuals appear so that we can show individualism. And so the attention isn't necessarily drawn to the fact that we're underrepresented folks or the characteristics in this case. But you'll see with Sam and Suzanne, the pronoun they appears regularly, as a matter of fact. That isn't the target language in this particular case, but it is just something that's regular and usual. And Suzanne is using. So clearly, Sam here is non-binary or a transgender man for example. But again, that isn't the focus in this particular case. So in the audio, was one opportunity to introduce a narrative and to make it more usual. Then we see it in text transcript as well, but we also see in the images. And so if we look at other images that appear in this unit with these couples, we can see a variety of different types of people, but more so in the language. So a usualization approach, as we just took a quick look into it with this coursebook unit, aims to include a wide variety of individuals who don't normally appear in our ELT materials, but are, in fact, people in our societies, including teachers, materials writers, and our learners themselves. And so when any of these types of characters and narratives appear, it can show that we value a wider variety of people, and we're not aspiring to be this type of person that we're not. And so from my perspective and my life growing up, you can trust me in when I say that it is very important to see yourself or people like you represented in order to make yourself feel as though you're not abnormal, I suppose, if you want to call it that, or specifically undervalued in society compared to others. And we do that through the use of audio, texts, and images. Now, we may then think, how can we complement a usualization approach to engage more learner action? And I say this because one sort of missing component of the usualization approach, as I mentioned, is that the focus isn't on the uniqueness or the special experiences of underrepresented folks. And so sometimes it can seem as though a usualization is presenting underrepresented folks as having the same experiences as, the white heteronormative person that often appears. And that simply isn't the case. So I don't think a usualization approach is where we stop. And so when I made that coursebook unit, I never intended for that to be the end goal of an inclusive practices suggestion. It was one component. And so now, if you think about that river that we saw at the beginning, I would say a usualization approach is really that step B, right? Where we're individually trying to find the pollution and make fixes. But we want to include learners and all learners into being more active in terms of improving the pollution level of the river, because more people doing it together obviously is going to make a bigger change. And so how can we do that? How can we complement a usualization approach for more engagement from learners? Well, to do that, I'm going to ask you to think of something first. And that is either take a look at a coursebook unit that you have nearby, or just use your imagination. Think about how a family might appear represented in typical ELT materials that you've seen or you've used. I wonder if they looked like this, or any of these people. Now, my guess is probably not. How many of those families, that you created in your mind of ELT materials represent even your own family? Why is it that even when we're looking at these ELT materials, these families, we just sort of gloss over the fact that they don't even match our own family in some ways, let alone more families that our students might have around them, as well as, just generally in the places that you teach. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that this family doesn't exist. Of course it exists. But there are a wide variety of other families, and this should not be the representative of a family. Not to mention the fact that this family is super happy and quite attractive and limited narrative options, in my opinion. Now, here's an example of two families that probably don't appear in course books very often. The one on the left, we can see they're in a situation, I think, that many relationships experience at some point or other. You can see there's definitely some sort of relationship issue happening. And the one on the right also are in a situation that many families probably experience, where they're trying to get ready in the morning, and things are just not happening too well in the morning. Now, in both of these cases, I think they're both valuable to include in our ELT materials as examples of a variety of different groups of people that are in our societies and should be represented. Simply the fact that they're including Black people is not itself beyond a usualization approach. However, if I look at the left couple here, I would argue that this couple is experiencing something or displaying something that happens to all sorts of couples. There's nothing specific about that situation that is because they're marginalized, typically. They're just having a fight of some sort, right? The couple on the right, on the other hand, I think we can argue that their experiences of society, being two dads of two daughters, is going to be something that is a marginalized experience. It's something that they will experience differently than that straight white couple we saw earlier. So when we're going to include a marginalized group in a way that complements a usualization approach, there's a difference between simply including Black people for the sake of variety and authenticity, and then including an underrepresented group of people because their experiences are going to be different. So when we include marginalized experiences, because they're marginalized due to whatever the status quo situation is, I call this a sort of more disruptive approach, because I don't have a better name for it, because it's just on the scale of disruption. It's more disruptive than, say, a usualization approach is. And in order to simplify what that means, I broke it down into sort of 5 steps for how we can include these experiences. The first is to identify a status quo situation that marginalizes or oppresses a certain group of people in some way. So in other words, we want to choose the theme for a lesson because it is something the learners experience in their daily lives and is generally accepted as the common belief or behavior, but it demonstrates a social inequity to one or more specific groups of people who are not the dominant power group. A second step then is to And so what I mean is to then situate this social norm that we've chosen for learners through the visuals, the texts, which are audio or written, and some critical questions. And so this provides a baseline for all learners to comment on their experiences of this social norm that we've chosen to identify. Teachers can then diagnose whether or not the learners have noticed this social norm in their lives. And so to members of a majority group, it's often something unnoticed or accepted as the status quo, and that will become clear as you discuss it with some learners. Asking learners critical questions here may facilitate an awareness and get learners thinking about how they experience this social norm. So this can begin raising learner awareness about the inequities of this social norm. And for learners who experience the inequities of the social norm, they're going to be nodding along going, you know what, I totally get this. I experience this and I identify with this situation. Now, I don't think the point here is to then spotlight those learners and make them represent their experiences unless they want to. But what we're getting at is we're realizing amongst our learners how many of them sort of just accept these for the way it is and how many of them don't. And that can provide a baseline for going forward. The third step of creating a more disruptive approach lesson then is to then include the experiences of marginalized people. So we'll hear or read about these marginalized individuals' experiences of this social norm, because that will then provide some insight to everybody about how that social norm marginalizes that group of people. So these narratives don't fit a usualization approach because we're intentionally drawing attention to the specific experiences of being marginalized. These experiences demonstrate how the social norm impacts marginalized individuals differently compared to the majority group. And it's important here for the materials writers to take good care in how they set up this narrative so that it doesn't make the marginalized group people seem strange or their experiences absurd, but as reasonable and human. The purpose here is to help some learners see their identities accurately reflected, valued, and worth being included in a discussion topic and the materials, so that they can get the language as well, practice language to talk about themselves. And for the other learners who don't identify with these marginalized experiences, it gives them the space to see perspectives different to their own, and potentially and hopefully build some empathy for different people and potentially consider new ways of looking at that social norm. A fourth component then is to build this connection. So we want to build personal connections to the problems that are caused by the social norms, so that people who identify as marginalized and experience the inequities of the social norm, they have a connection to that. But the learners who don't identify as marginalized in this particular situation also will have a connection to the social norm and how it is important in their lives. So, I mean, ultimately, if we want all learners to critically evaluate this social norm, they first have to care about it. So the most effective way to do this is to help learners build connections between others and themselves. And we can create questions and activities that encourage learners to notice these connections. By doing so, we can build empathy for others' experiences, and that's because we can identify with them through this connection. This helps everyone start to understand that the social norm is not the way things have to be. That it's not ideal for you, it's not ideal for me, it's not ideal for anyone except those people who have the power and want to continue having that power at the expense of other people. Then finally, the last sort of culminating step of this lesson plan would be then to improve the situation through an activity or a lesson. So ultimately, disruptive materials aim to level out everyone's experiences in terms of awareness, values, and understanding. Disruptive materials involve the learners in discussing how to improve the lives of all members of society, regardless of the difference, and not to simply accept what is currently considered normal and too difficult or inconvenient to change. So, in other words, the status quo. Possibly to end off the lesson, disruptive materials can push the learners to collaboratively look forward and to empower them to make changes to this social norm. I mean, they're going to be doing so in their own languages as well as in English. And so giving them the sort of push towards this direction is something that as educators, we have the affordance to do. Now, in your teacher's notes, you can encourage the teacher to point out that learning a new language and effectively communicating in it may have seemed impossible to the learners once too. So making changes to the status quo can now seem a little bit more realistic than it may have before. So all of that, I hope sounds like it makes sense. there are these 5 steps to create a disruptive approach lesson, and maybe it would be helpful to see a couple of examples. So I recently finished this book called How to Write Inclusive Materials, and the timing was just coincidental that it came out just before IATEFL happened. And honestly, it was not planned that way, because I should have been able to get this book done a little bit earlier than that. But, you know, pandemic. So what I'm going to show you is a couple of example lessons, or at least an insight to a couple of example lessons from this book that demonstrate this disruptive approach. One is for a lower level class, because I want to show that this is possible in an intermediate or a slightly below intermediate class, as well as a higher level class. And so the first lesson has a target language of family relationships, at-home activities, progressive verbs, right, that type of thing. And the social norm that we've identified for this lesson is what is a family, an expectation about what families are. But a kind of secondary one is the expectation about learning materials and what the content of learning materials are versus, you know, the reality of life itself. So those are kind of 2 social norms that are going to come out in this lesson. And then I'm going to show you a quick higher level lesson as well, where we have a little bit more language at our disposal. And the target language in this case will be problem solution. The social norm that I've identified that marginalizes people is public washrooms. And not only that, but other sort of binary choices. So let's start with the lower level lesson first. Here I've got a picture of a family, and the first thing that we want to do is situate it. So in the lesson, we ask the learners to think about some questions like, what's happening in this photo? You know, it's a selfie, but you know, what's actually happening? Why are they together? Who are each of these people in relationship to each other? Maybe what are their names? So in doing so, we get to realize what students' sort of perceptions are about families kind of going into it by looking at this. And maybe not their perceptions solely about families themselves, but at least about families in ELT materials. So as I mentioned, asking the students who's who can reveal what students expect are the natural relationships between family members here. Not to mention the fact that I asked, you know, to name each of these people as well, and that can reveal something quite interesting too. Finally, I'm gonna tell you that there's somebody missing actually from this occasion. So if you look around the table, I want you to think, okay, who do you think is the missing family member from this picture? Next, we see a picture here, and we move to a telephone conversation. And so we can play it as audio or perhaps as a text, but let's do an audio, or let's pretend it's an audio. And so the students then hear this conversation. So it's a transcript that I'm going to show you. And so we hear bring, bring, cell phone. And Jody looks at the incoming call and sees that it's Sadia. So Jody, in a kind of Italian accent, says, "Hey babe, how's the shift going?" I'm not gonna do it for you. Sadia, with her Brazilian accent, then says, "Hi honey, we're really busy tonight, lots of calls. Right now we're just taking a quick break. I got your photo, thanks. Looks like everyone's enjoying themselves." Okay, so at this point, we can start to recognize that the photo we just saw is the photo that's being talked about here. And so Jody obviously is the one who took the photo and sent it to Sadia, as Sadia is just saying, "Oh, great, thanks." Jody, yes, dinner went well. I was just brewing some coffee. The bolo de rolo you made was amazing. Of course, Juliana loved it. Here we can see some of the household activities and progressive verbs that we mentioned are the target language that are happening. You'll note that bolo de rolo is at least some dish, if you can't figure out from context which dish it is, but it's some dish anyway. So we can see that English isn't solely used. Well, it is what she asked for instead of cake. Okay, so now we can see that it is a kind of dessert. Is everyone behaving? Well, Mom and Uncle Franco have been talking about politics, of course. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Your mom can't help herself, can she? Is Lucas being good to Joanna or Juliana? Yeah, he's being surprisingly nice to his sister, but right now they're flipping through the channels to find something to watch. I think they might argue soon. Dad's getting all the gifts ready, so maybe we can open them up before that happens. Auntie Paloma's cleaning up, of course. I told her not to bother, but you know her. When do you think you'll be home? Oh, probably around 8. So I should go, though. I'll see you soon. Okay, love you. Bye. Love you too. Okay, so this is the phone call that they're going to hear, or if you choose in the text to read through. And we can see now it's about that photo that we just saw, that selfie that we just saw. And, you know, taking a selfie at a family occasion is quite authentic. I mean, I've done it several times, and I posted it to Instagram. And sometimes I've posted it to someone who isn't there. But we can see that Sadia is working, and so that's the reason why she's not at this meal. We can also see all sorts of target language that's coming up here, all the progressive verbs that are included. We can see the different household activities that are being mentioned, and there's more of them to come. And we can actually start to identify all the different people that are in the photo as well. So as part of a comprehension activity, then the students would then need to hear and take notes, maybe read that transcript, and start to answer some questions about who's who. And so on the materials, they've got a space where they can label the name of the person, but also the relationship of that person to the rest of the family members. And so we heard Franco was one of the names, so that's that guy there, and he's the uncle, right? Oops, let's go back. What I think this will reveal, interestingly, is that what was the perception of the students about who all of these different family members are? Who did they think was missing from this group? Does that reveal anything about a status quo or a marginalized experience? I would say probably. Did they assume that the names of all these people were different than the names that they actually were or are? And you know, even what type of occasion is happening here, you know, that can reveal what a sort of typical version of this family might be perceived to be instead of what it actually is. So now with the target language, of course, they're exposed to some of the target language here, but a follow-up activity then could be talking about Sadia's afternoon. And so before Sadia went to work, what did Sadia do during the afternoon that led up to this occasion? What types of household activities did she do? Did she bake the bolo de riolo? Did she have some interaction with her kids, her wife, her mother-in-law, you know? And I think what this can really do is bring out not only an awareness of sort of the similarities between her life and, say, the students' lives themselves, no matter whether they are identify as LGBTQ or Black or Brazilian or Italian. So they can see that there's probably some similar things that are happening in her lifestyle, but maybe also they can start to think about ways in which Sadia might experience the world a little differently than everybody else. Now, of course, the final activity really in a disruptive approach is to think of ways in which we can improve the status quo so that everyone feels more belonging. And I don't think in this particular situation at this lower level that that's a super realistic goal, given the amount, of language that people have available to them. But I would venture to say that the next time students think about what families are, what family relationships are by default um, in their ELT materials or just around them, they're going to start to, double guess what the default type of family is, what those relationships are, who even the names of all these people are. And so I think the disruptive aspect here is really raising that awareness in the learners themselves and starting to help them see how a different family may experience the world around them. Now let's move on to a higher level example where we have more language available to us and see how the 5 steps may play out. So I want you to keep in mind what those 5 steps are again, right? We have identify a social norm. We have situate that social norm so people can recognize their own connection to that social norm and their experience of that social norm. We then have to include marginalized experiences of that social norm, so that raises some awareness, but also helps some learners identify. We have connect, right? So make connections between the learners' experiences themselves and the experiences of the marginalized people. And then we have improve, right? So a culminating type of activity where they aim to improve something about the status quo to make everybody experience the world better. So think about those 5 as I talk about this higher level unit. Now, are you person A or are you person B? I took these images from that website, Two Kinds of People, and they're quite enthralling. And when I've asked students this myself, it's quite engaging. You get a lot of response and some very heated or emotionally stimulating responses. Are you person A or are you person B? Are you person A? Are you person B? One more. Are you person A? Are you person B? So what this opening task sort of establishes is that there's a kind of accepted binary choice, right? You're either going to be person A or you're either going to be person B. And I wonder if, in fact, some of you, when you thought about that, immediately identified, oh, for sure, I'm person A. Or maybe some of you were like, well, I don't know. I'm not always A, but I'm not always B either. But it's presented as an either or choice. And so this leads into a question I would have for the learners, which is, where in our daily lives do we often make this kind of choice, right? Where are we expected to be a person A or a person B? Where do we have no option but to choose A or B, because that is just the accepted nature of the choice? One of those that comes to mind are washrooms, bathrooms, restrooms, whatever you want to call them. And so when we think of these washroom situations, there's quite traditionally a male washroom or a men's washroom and a female or a women's washroom. Those tend to be the 2 binary choices available. And in quite a number of situations, we can see variations of these choices represented by the logos or the characters that are drawn on the doors to help identify which is which. And so we can see football is what's identified here for the men's washroom in the one photo, and shopping is for the women's. We can see Batman versus Wonder Woman to help identify. And so I'm sure if you sort of look around your society, you probably can find quite a few examples of men's and women's washrooms where those are the binary choices that you have available to you. but you then also have representations of men and women and masculine and feminine characteristics or behaviors that may or may not be something you personally identify with. The next part of the unit then is to introduce a couple of experiences of washroom situations in society. And so the first then is from this woman who is a cishet female. And so when we say cishet, we're saying cisgender. So in other words, she identifies as the sex she was assigned at birth. So that's female in this case. And het is the heterosexual part. So she also is a heterosexual woman, self-identified. So her experiences are what we're going to hear from first. What we hear in the audio or maybe as a text are her opinions about these washroom choices, in particular, the relationship of the representation to femininity. So she's going to be talking about largely how she sees the representation of, a thin woman with a dress, for example, potentially a white woman, potentially someone who loves shopping, and how those characteristics may seem ridiculous to her. Then we're going to hear a second set of accounts from this person here, who is a non-binary person. In other words, they don't identify either as male or female. And we'll hear about their experiences with regards to washroom choice. So it's going to be a little different than the experiences we saw from the cishet woman just before, but not entirely different insofar as representation is concerned. But of course, their experiences are going to probably involve the lack of choice, right, surrounding which washroom it is that they go into, because there is no non-binary washroom. I don't know if that is the solution, but they may talk about how they feel uncomfortable going into either the men's washroom or the women's washroom because of how they present, because of the way people will react to their presence in either one of those washrooms. Potentially, they hold their need to go to the washroom until they can go home. So there might be a wider variety of experiences that this person shows from having the status quo of this binary choice available to them. Now, of course, the target language is problem solution. So when we bring these two narratives together, we would have the students then summarize the audio. So that's where we're getting some of that problem solution language, because we're both cases talked about a problem, and both cases talked potentially about what those problems were, so that the students can start to think about solutions, or maybe they presented solutions in the audio itself. We can ask then to connect to other groups. So again, how can we get the students who don't identify as either of these women to understand and feel a relationship to this problem? Well, we can ask the students what other people are limited by washroom choices. You might think of disabled people. Sure, in some situations there's a third bathroom, which is a disabled bathroom, but of course, what does that do? That sort of pushes another category of people. You have to go into this one. So even if you identify as a cishet male, but you're in a wheelchair that doesn't fit into the doors or the stalls, you still then have to go to this different washroom. So again, what other people are limited by washroom choices? Another question, how can we improve public washrooms to be accessible and safe for all people? So here we're asking the students then to make a connection to not only people that they don't identify with, but people in their own situations. So how can they make every washroom actually accessible to everybody? they may come up with solutions kind of like these ones, right, where we've got family and all gender washrooms, or potentially that there are campaigns where you're trying to educate the society that whoever's in the washroom belongs there. They know whether they should be in that place or not. But we can then, critique these solutions and talk about whether they actually create any extra problems. And I think that the students would then be able to think of some ideas or some ways in which this causes a problem, even though it's masked as a solution. So then a final task might then be for the students to identify and improve another social choice. So we've started this whole process with identifying social norms being binary choices, and then asking the students, okay, well, let's move away from the washroom scenario, and maybe you can think of a different situation in your own life where there is a social choice that appears to be binary, and maybe we can fix that or change that. And so what might that be? And that gives the students some autonomy to try to work together and think of a different social norm that might be fixable, or at least a solution proposed. So usualizing the array of marginalized folks, as I say, can be complemented by a more disruptive approach. And so when we say disruptive, I'm of course not suggesting that it's super confrontational. What it is using or highlighting the experiences of marginalized people in comparison or as related to a status quo in a way that allows all learners to make a connection to that situation. It raises their awareness of that experience. And it gives them an opportunity to try to think of ways in which they can improve that situation using English for everybody involved, not just the marginalized folks themselves. So we put together all 5 of these ways, and what we end up doing is creating this kind of disruption, right? A space that is beautiful amongst all this concrete. So if we go back to my initial metaphor from long, long ago now, I would argue that A is invisibility, right? A is when we're just happy-go-lucky and not even realizing that there's a problem in terms of inclusion. B is when we have kind of individually woken up and we're starting to try to find ways ourselves to improve a situation. And I think a usualization approach is primarily this, right? It is an individual materials writer's attempt or a teacher's attempt at supplementing materials to include a wider variety of people. And that's great. But then C is more of the more disruptive approach, where we're not only doing B, but we're also including the learners themselves in trying to clean up this mess. And then D would be the ultimate systemic change, where we get the publishers, we get the school administrators, we get the teaching associations, we get employers, we get everybody on board in order to make the changes necessary so that the pollution itself doesn't even start. And so that, of course, would be the ultimate goal of an inclusive approach. So that little yellow graphic just means that's where we are in terms of disruption. So I'd like to end this really by saying, in order to get to that sort of last place, that D, which I think is the biggest systemic change that's necessary, some things need to happen. One first is that we as teachers or materials writers, we have to have a willingness to examine our roles in this situation. We have the power to keep things going in the way that they have always been going, and therefore we have the power to not do that as well. So we do have a certain amount of power, but we have to accept that we have played a role in continuing the marginalization of some learners and teachers and anyway, members of our society in our classes. And once we can accept that, then we can do something about it. We do, of course, need to have inclusive materials, right? So, we can't rely on teachers to supplement and create all these materials themselves. We as materials writers, too, need to learn how to and create inclusive materials. Of course, we need to have ongoing teacher training. So it's one thing to provide these materials, but it's another thing to actually know how to use them appropriately, and examine the ways in which we approach classes and learners ourselves as teachers. And so having a one-off session kind of like this one is, great, but it's insignificant in comparison to what's actually necessary. So within pre-service teacher programs like CELTA, we need to include units, and significant units, not just a one-day kind of thing, on how to be a representative teacher and an inclusive practices practitioner. But then we need ongoing training after that as well. So not something that is just once and done. And ultimately, to make the biggest change, we need institutional support. And by institutional support, I am talking about major publishers out there. You need to get on board and not succumb to the restrictions that you accept from different countries or different organizations in the world that prevent belonging, inclusion, diversity, representation from happening. But on top of that, schools, you yourselves and the directors of them and the employers of them need to examine your policies, your employment policies, and really support your LGBTQ staff or allies who are trying to, in fact, make change, and give them the support that they need, which includes, clear-cut policy, but also this ongoing training that I'm talking about. Teaching associations need to do the same. Overall, we need to examine why it is and who it is that are the leaders in our teaching associations, and what their perspectives are, and whether or not we're maintaining a certain group of people to have the power all the time, or whether we're distributing that power amongst a wider variety of people and voices that need to be heard in order for these things to happen. So we can disrupt the heteronormative status quo of ELT materials together if we do a bunch of these things. I really thank you for even having the interest to be a part of this talk, to listen to me blabble on for a little while, and to potentially pick up my book. So thank you very much, and I really hope to hear from you and get your ideas and see what your inclusive materials are, but also how you can use your power in other ways to change the status quo. Thank you very much.